Okay. Everybody ready for me to start? Okay. I think I'll wait. Is that fixed?
What? Yeah.
So I'm not bleeding over anymore? Oh. All right. Okay. This presentation is, wow, that's loud, is pen testing security vendors. This is probably not the presentation you're expecting, so sorry, but I'll get started here. So, my company is RJS. They get a shout out because they paid for my plane ticket and my hotel room. They also get a shout out because they took a chance on me and are letting me build the security practice that I've always wanted to do. However, that's not the presentation DerbyCon wanted me to come and give, so we'll talk about something completely different. Let me introduce myself. This is me. I've been doing this for a while, and this is what I do. So, with the intros out of the way, let's dig into the problem. Suppose you want to deploy a new technology. Unless you choose open source, you're going to be using vendors, which means you have to assess them. If you use another's assessment, you're stuck with their beliefs, which may or may not meet your needs. As companies change, as some companies become more complex and some become more simple, the standard reviews that we see online increasingly don't apply. But that's counterbalanced by the fact that if you gather too much data, you get stuck in analysis paralysis, and it takes too long, you never actually get the technology deployed. If you gather too little, you run the risk of making the wrong decision. So you need a way to actually assess vendors. The second problem is more specific to security conferences. It turns out that when you publicly assess security vendors, you run the risk of really ticking them off. And ticking off security vendors can in some cases be a career-limiting move. So there has to be a way to assess security vendors without upsetting them, right? Right. Pen testing. Actually use the technologies being assessed. Focus on fast assessment, avoid wasting too much time. In this case, instead of using the actual vendor's technologies, I'm going to be using pens. You're about to sit through a 40-minute long pun. My apologies. The hard thing to know is what you're going to need in the future, okay? Past performance is no guarantee of future results. So in the past, when I did these sorts of assessments, you took vendors' history in case, and you'd look at kind of what were their problems, how do they deal with it, stuff like that. Things are changing so fast that doesn't really make sense. But you can take a general guess as to what you need. With pens, you have to be able to write, and you have to be able to trust what's written, which means you build some anticipatory metrics. Okay? We map what we need to what's easily measurable. And then it's a matter of rapidly cycling through all of the assessments you have to do to get as much data as you need to make the decision as quickly as possible. So what did I do? I took these little anticipatory metric sheets and overlaid them on the logos, and I went through pens. I went through this many pens, sketching out all of the logos and collecting data. And then you figure out how you want to analyze. A lot of people like to analyze based on CIA, confidence, integrity, availability. I don't like that. I prefer the Parkerian hexad, which is confidentiality, possession or control, integrity, authenticity, availability, and utility. Now, why? This is about looking at facets of technology. The actual thing you're looking at doesn't matter so much as how quickly you go through this cycle and how evenly you can collect the data. I don't like CIA because there simply aren't enough facets. It doesn't guide your thinking well enough. I don't like the CSSP domain model because there are too many. If you're going through 10 different cycles trying to collect data, it just takes too long. I like the hexad because there are 6 of them, not because of what the 6 of them are. It matters more to have something that guides your thoughts than it does to have something that gives you full coverage, because it's security. You're never going to get full coverage, so don't even bother trying. So the first thing, pens were highly available. Every conference I went to, they were giving them to me, handing them to me, and some of them I had multiples of. So I'm not going to get much into the availability. That's pretty easy to test. Confidentiality, I ran several tests. In every single case, I could read my own writing. None of the pens supported native encryption, but all of them supported whichever method of encryption I wanted to use. So that was nice. In other words, this was a technology in which encryption was an ancillary process that could easily be layered on. For possession and control, in no case did the technology itself provide a particular level of control over itself. In one case, a pen was in fact stolen from me by feline interference, but I could not replicate the event. However, doing a quick Google search, looking on Flickr, it does seem to be a problem inherent in the technology, so I didn't count it a problem in any particular vendor. Okay? Now, utility. This is where things start to matter. I'm losing my audience. I knew it would happen. Okay. Certain pens did not work at all. These pens sucked. They ripped the paper, they didn't put any ink down, complete technological failure. Discounted them early on. Now, why does this matter? Because, in general, unless the technology is bleeding edge, most vendors are about the same. Most AV vendors are going to give you acceptable AV. Most network vendors are going to give you acceptable network protection. What matters more is, are people going to use the technology to its full capabilities? So how people feel about the technology they're using matters a lot more than technological capabilities, which is why when people put technology in place and vendors promise it will do all these things, it never actually does, it's usually a utility problem. Okay? There are also some interesting notes. This is what I call a lying technology. Pretends to be a pen, it's not actually a pen. Okay? There are other types of lying technology that you may find when you look at actual security technology that you go to deploy. That's not something I can talk about when being recorded to put on the internet, but I'm sure you've all had your own stories where you've encountered this. So, there we go. Going through utility, we look at the winners. Okay? These were ones that, when you click a pen, it just feels good, and nice solid click, it's not too weak, and how easy it is to determine how to activate the pen. Anybody go to the semantic table out there? Anybody figure out how to activate those pens, or you need help? You figured it out? Congratulations. Okay, so some technology is hard to use. Some technology is not. In this case, Aruba and VMware were great technologies. Their pens worked great. And this is what they looked like. There were losers. The Sophos one was hard to use. The Tripwire one was very hard to use. In general, technologies that perform more than one function are difficult to use. There were some pens that had multiple features. 3 of them glowed. 1 of them was robotic. This is what, it's not flipping. Okay. This is what the robotic pen looks like. Anybody use this pen? Look familiar? Anybody notice it came with instructions? If technology comes with instructions for the base users to be able to use, they're not going to use it. It needs to be intuitive, or your users or your team is simply not going to use it. Okay? Then there was comfort. Hands can cramp, people can drop the pen. These were the winners for comfort. Just using them was nice. And this is what they looked like. And then the loser, of course, was the one that was the hardest to hold. So not a lot to talk about there. In general, the technologies, the pens that were very heavy or very light were hard to use over time. Turns out this is true with security technology too. Security technology that's too light to use isn't going to be used. People can't get done what they want to get done, and they're simply not going to use it. Technology that's too heavy is hard to figure out. It's difficult to use over time. People aren't going to use it. So if you're going through this massive set of vendors and it falls into one of those two categories, pitch them. There's no point in going any further. Smoothness of writing. This is ease of use during, actual use. If a nib is sharp or draggy, it performs poorly. If a tool is a joy to use, it's going to be used more. These were the ones that were most fun to use. And these are the ones that were the worst. Okay? Any of those look familiar? The flashy pen is common. Now, another interesting thing that you find, some technologies don't seem to have changed in terms of design or function since the early 1990s. Okay. Another dimension is integrity. It's important that whatever technology you select, it can be relied upon not to be interfered with. This is the fun part because you get to mess with the technology and look at the output. Now, when I started this plan, I thought I was going to turn all of these pens into launchers and show you all sorts of videos of things flying around the room. Turns out, didn't work. Couldn't turn a single pen into a reliable launcher. They just don't convert easily. So I had to change expectations. As I was doing this, I found out that some vendors truly care about your security and their pens come equipped with protection. Some of the protection applies more to the pen than to you. This is true with security technology too. Who do they care about? Do they care about you? Do they care about them? A lot of vendors seem to care about not being caught in the news. Some vendors actually care about being easier to use. Ink testing was by far the most fun. For the first time in my life, my mechanics tests failed, but chemistry worked fine. It was perfect. I tested 6 solvents at 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and 20 minutes, and didn't see any changes past 20 minutes. So I expected mineral spirits to work. There was really nothing interesting that happened there. TRPS, which is it's turpentine replacement petroleum-based substitute, in case anybody cares what that means. That wasn't interesting too. The Goo-Gone test I thought would be interesting, but it didn't actually do anything to the ink. However, the protective sleeve that I put it in afterwards, it dissolved the sleeve. So that was unexpected. Takeaway here is when you're assessing things, unexpected things happen, you have to deal with it. In this case, I was worried that the residue would trigger things in the TSA, but it didn't. But alcohol. Security people like alcohol, right? Finally, we got some data to play with. We got losers. Blue Coat, Bradford Networks, Edgewave, ESET, Landesk, Logarithm, Maru, Encircle, SourceFire, and Varonis all dissolved away. Complete failure on those pens. Now, speaking of alcohol, this was another liar pen. Okay, some technology simply didn't do what it did. This one got confiscated from me by the TSA. You can't take this one through the airport. Acetone was interesting. You see some more general lightening here, but it's the same results. The same pens that had problems suffered from the same attacks. It's worth running the same attacks against vendors that you're assessing to see if they're vulnerable. If you have 2 different attacks that knock out the same sets of vendors, those are vendors that are not worth looking at. But Liftoff was interesting. Liftoff took almost everything out, and this is how you get winners. Okay? In this case, Astaro, Endace, M86, McAfee, Sophos, and Trend Micro all won. Okay? There was no problem there. They all worked, and with the exception of Astaro, they all ranked high in levels of utility. Okay? Authenticity also matters. There's little that's new in technology, much is shared, much is unclear. You have to find a way to rapidly assess in a limited amount of time. One is to look at OEM. Okay? All of these vendors use the same technology in pens, not in their actual security. But you see this in other vendors. You see this, patch management. You see this with AV engines. You see this with network technology that people are using. There's a lot of OEM going on in the space. And there's no point in going deep into testing of different security technologies if they're using the same OEM backend. You can save a lot of time by testing what the OEM is doing and discounting or approving based on that. You can also look at where the technology comes from. In this case, there were a lot of pens that came from China, a few that came from Korea, some that came from Japan. This is true for big technology we're using as well. So when it comes time to put it all together, we combine the winners and losers. In this example, we're going to assume that foreign governments have the ability to spy on what we write by looking at the types of pens. So we simply discount a whole swath of technologies based on where it comes from, and we look at the winners. And this gets the set down to something that's small enough and workable. In this case, there were conflicts between the dimensions we were looking at, and have to look at, what do we care about? In this case, decided I wasn't that concerned about spying, so we get the short list, okay? And it comes down to filtering. The point of all of this is to get an unwielable number of technologies down to something we can actually care about. So we have a short list, we want to make it a little bit shorter. So I mentioned weight, okay? The VMware pen was particularly heavy, it was at 20 grams. By discounting this pen, everything was in the 10 to 14 gram range. In actual use, you would look at how heavy the technology is to use, something that's going to take you a lot of time to really get tuned, really get deployed, is something that you might want to knock off the short list if you don't need something else that's in it. Utility is another point. The McAfee unscrewed itself during the initial test, the Astaro lacked smoothness, and Aruba had mid-range comfort, okay? Again, this isn't anything that's wrong with the technologies, we're just trying to get it down to something that's workable, something we can do deeper tests on and actually spend our time appropriately. And then there's integrity, double checking. We find the Beyond IP didn't actually do very well during some of the ink tests, so we knock that out, and we're down to the final four. Okay? At this point, you would dedicate a day or two to each technology and do further tests. This could be whatever makes sense in your organization, depending on what type of technology you're using. With pens, throw them at the ceiling, write 2-page essays, write fiction, ink some comic books, play with things like that. In a more real case, run actual detailed tests. Do more than just throw the Iker file at it. Download actual malware, run it against the test, but don't just test whether or not it detects. We get far too caught up in detection rates in security technology. The point of all of this is to look at the multiple dimensions, go back through the 6 different tests you were doing and go much deeper, okay? This is where I stop being silly and get a little bit serious. If you are running a security technology and you have something that measures highly in one realm but fails totally in another realm, that's a failure, okay? If you have something that has a high catch rate but is so complex your people aren't going to use it, that's a failure. If you have something that's really easy to use but doesn't catch anything, that's a failure. If you can get good analytics but you can't figure out how to apply the analytics, that's a failure, okay? We wind up with technology that looks pretty and does well during these very cursory tests because we either have time to go very, very light or go very, very heavy in our testing. And that's a failure in either case, okay? What you need to do is go really, really light to knock out as much stuff as you can and get down to a handful that's worth going really, really deep on. And that really is the point of this talk, okay? So, we can look at some glowy pens. Before we get into Q&A, I just want to show you these because they're pretty. So, we can all say ooh, ah. Okay. Sophos pen is nice because it blinks. So, that's it. I know it wasn't what you were expecting. I know it's short, but I hope it was worth your time. Any questions? Criticize my approach? Anybody? Sure. The spreadsheet, the actual useful piece? Okay. All right, there you go. So this is the Parker and Hex ad, and you can get, actually, Wikipedia is a good source for this, has some links as to why he chose this approach. I personally find it better than CIA. You could do this entire approach with CIA. You do this entire approach just based on how fast it is to do things. The point is to cycle through it and not just do a single proof of concept and say yay or nay. Yes? For the pens, it took me several weeks. When I do this with technology, it generally takes me 1 week to knock out everything that's simply not going to work. Sometimes it takes as little as a day. You can find that by just doing basic internet research. Suppose you're looking at antivirus, which is one of the ones people do this the most on because it's one of the oldest security technologies. A lot of people look at who ranks highest in the various independent reports. That's not what you care about. What you care about is who ranks lowest consistently. The people that rank, take the bottom 50% and ditch them. There's absolutely no point in going any further down the process with those. Okay? You can weed out a lot in a day or two. And then you can spend a couple of weeks doing more in-depth testing. Just figure out what you're testing before you do it. Otherwise, you wind up pushing bias into your process, and it biases you pretty hard. Yeah.
One bias is looking at your X capability.
Mm-hmm.
Where you start looking at cost, saying you start looking at security vendors, you got 6 that are fairly equal. You got one vendor who goes, you already got this product that's being pointed at because we give us the I'll give you this as well.
In almost all cases, cost is negotiable. Okay? The reason cost isn't on here is because if you're good at what you do, you pick a first choice and a second choice. And you go to your first choice and say, you are my first choice, but my second choice is 50% cheaper. If you can meet that price, I'll buy you. Otherwise, I'll go with them. Straightforward negotiation. And because you've gone through the process, either one's going to be pretty good. Because you're not going for best, you're going for good enough. And all the pens were free. Yeah. Yes. Oh, no. I submitted this to the CFP as a joke. I submitted other things not as a joke, and it surprised me this is the one that they chose, but here we are, here I am, so. Mm-hmm.
And this is a huge issue. There's a lot of need for regulation. There's a lot of need for training. You can probably make a living.
I probably could. It's less interesting than what I do for real life, but yeah. I mean, yeah. The other thing you have to realize is the big assessment firms, whose names I'm not going to say on something that's going on the internet, in order to get assessed, an organization has to put forth a lot of money. And that means that you're missing, if you go off of somebody else's research, you're missing a lot of solutions that could be really good. I really like certain niche solutions that are out there, not because they're technologically superior to the ones that have the big money, but because by being smaller, they're more willing to work with you. And that actually boosts the utility rating and some of these other ease of use ratings, because instead of selling you the technology and walking away, they come in with you. Whether they're renting you a consultant or not, they make sure it works before they leave. And I've seen so many companies that call me in because the person that set up their big name vendor deployment has left. And they've ignored it for a year, and it's complete failure. So that's why I use this process. Yeah. Oh, the red is rejection, the green is winner. So because it's a dual loop process, the first loop intended to knock vendors out, you end up eliminating a whole lot of vendors very fast. It's all about buying time to use later in the process. Yes. I think that's going to depend on the industry. Yeah. I have a lot of auditors I've met seem to be in the audit business to fail firms. The auditors I've met that are actually good are ones that work with the firm. So it's not about is internal versus external the right way to go. It's about, can you prove that this external firm is capable of doing a better job of assessment than you could do yourself? And audit becomes a discussion.
It just sort of seems like a lab should be able to set, I realize I'm very different, but a lab should be able to get an economy of scale that you can't get doing it in every shop.
That's true, but labs are also incentivized to pull in metrics that don't make sense for everybody. Because the more metrics that show up in the reports, the more valuable the reports look. Okay? And one of the problems I see in going with, first of all, I don't know of any third-party assessment firm I would consider truly independent. Right. But even if they did exist, I would question whether the metrics they would choose to assess a vendor on are going to be the metrics that matter most in your organization. I've worked with some organizations where they don't care where the technology originates. I've worked with other organizations where that is by far the most critical factor. And it's a weighting problem. So. Anything else? Was it okay that it wasn't the presentation you were all expecting? Okay. What? I would probably not be the one to do that one, simply because I'm not willing to be recorded with some of the things I've found. If there were a closed track that's not recorded, I think that would make a wonderful panel. And I agree with you, and I'm sorry it's not what you wanted. Yeah, if you end the recording, yeah, I would be fine to discuss some of the things. I haven't gone deep into all of the different. Okay. Goodbye, Internet.